Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. Quine's Gavagai problem? Why we can never know what anyone really means. An anthropologist arrives in a remote village to study an unknown language, a language no outsider has encountered before. And the anthropologist has no translator, no dictionary, no common linguistic framework, only observations and patience, and the method is radical translation. Learning the language from scratch by observing how natives use words in response to events. And one day, a rabbit runs past and a native points and says Gavagai, and the anthropologist writes in the notebook, Gavagai means rabbit. And this seems reasonable, seems like an obvious inference. The native saw a rabbit and said Gavagai, so Gavagai must refer to rabbits. But philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine points out a problem, a deep problem about meaning and translation. Because Gavagai might mean rabbit, but it might also mean undetached rabbit part, or rabbit stage, or collection of rabbit molecules, or instance of rabbithood. And all these translations are consistent with the native's behaviour. All would lead the native to say Gavagai in exactly the same circumstances, whenever a rabbit is present, and there is no fact of the matter, no objective truth about which translation is correct, no way to determine what Gavagai really means. And this indeterminacy is not due to practical limitations, not due to insufficient evidence, but is fundamental, is a consequence of how meaning works. And this is Quine's Gavagai problem, also called the problem of indeterminacy of translation, a challenge to the idea that words have determinate meanings, that translation has right answers, and that we can know what others mean when they speak. Imagine trying to distinguish between Gavagai means rabbit, and Gavagai means undetached rabbit part. And you point to the rabbit, and the native says Gavagai, and you point to the rabbit's ear and ask whether this is Gavagai, and the native responds, but you do not know whether the response means yes because the ear is an undetached rabbit part or no, because the ear is not a whole rabbit, or something else entirely. And every test you design, every question you ask, can be interpreted in multiple ways, can be answered consistently by multiple translations, and no amount of observation, no behavioural evidence can definitively settle which translation is correct, because the native's behaviour under all possible circumstances is compatible with multiple interpretations. And Quine argues that this shows meaning is indeterminate, that there is no fact about what Gavagai really means, only different translation manuals that work equally well, that map the native's language onto ours in different but equally legitimate ways. The problem generalizes beyond anthropology to all understanding of language, because even when we share a language, even when we both speak English, the Gavagai problem applies. We cannot be certain that we mean the same thing by our words, that rabbit means to you what it means to me. We might be using different concepts, carved up differently, but our behavior is similar enough that we never notice the difference. And this raises the disturbing possibility that communication is always partial, always approximate, that we never fully understand each other, that meaning is not something objective that words have, but something we impose through interpretation, and different interpretations can fit the evidence equally well, and there is no transcendent perspective from which to judge which interpretation is correct. Visualize meaning as a relationship between words and world, and Quine's point is that this relationship is underdetermined by behaviour, by the evidence available to translators, because infinitely many relationships are consistent with the same behavioural evidence. Infinitely many ways of mapping words to world produce the same observable patterns, and choosing among these possibilities requires going beyond evidence, requires making decisions that are not forced by facts. and these decisions constitute meaning rather than discovering it. And so meaning is partially conventional, partially stipulated, not fully determined by reality. The Gavagai problem challenges referential theories of meaning, theories that say words mean things because they refer to objects in the world, because rabbit refers to rabbits, and water refers to water, and Quine's argument shows that reference is inscrutable, cannot be determined from behaviour alone, because words can be interpreted as referring to different things, different ways of carving up reality, and all interpretations fit the evidence, and so reference is not an objective relation, but is relative to a translation manual, relative to a scheme of interpretation, and different manuals. Different schemes can assign different references to the same words while remaining equally correct. One response to the Gavagai problem accepts the indeterminacy, embraces it as a truth about meaning, argues that Quine is right, that there is no fact of the matter about what words mean beyond what is determined by behavioural evidence, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of beliefs and language practices. And translation manuals are theoretical frameworks that organise this evidence. And like all theories, they are underdetermined by data, and multiple theories fit the same data equally well. And choosing among them involves pragmatic considerations, simplicity, utility, coherence, but not truth in any absolute sense. And this response treats meaning as a human construction, something we create through practices rather than something we discover in nature. Another response denies the indeterminacy, argues that Quine's thought experiment is artificial, that in real translation situations additional evidence is available, evidence about intentions, about how speakers correct each other, about the structure of their conceptual schemes. And this additional evidence narrows down the possibilities, rules out bizarre interpretations like undetached rabbit part, and determines that Gavagai means rabbit in the ordinary sense. And while perfect certainty may be impossible, practical determinacy is achievable, and meaning is objective enough for communication to succeed, for translation to have right and wrong answers. And the Gavagai problem is an epistemological worry, a concern about how we know what words mean, but it does not show that words lack determinate meanings, only that discovering those meanings is difficult. A third response appeals to charity, to the principle that we should interpret speakers as making sense, as having coherent beliefs, as speaking truly most of the time. And this principle constrains translation, rules out interpretations that make speakers irrational or massively mistaken. And while charity does not uniquely determine translation, it narrows the range of acceptable interpretations, and combined with simplicity and other pragmatic virtues, it makes translation tractable, makes it possible to arrive at good translations, even if not perfect ones. And this response treats translation as an interpretive practice, guided by norms rather than as a purely empirical investigation, guided only by behaviour. The Gavagai problem also connects to broader philosophical issues about realism and anti-realism, about whether there are objective facts independent of our theories and languages. Because if meaning is indeterminate, then perhaps reality itself is indeterminate. Perhaps there is no fact about whether rabbits or undetached rabbit parts exist, only different ways of organising experience, different conceptual schemes that carve up the world differently. And Quine's ontological relativity, his claim that what objects exist is relative to a language or theory, follows from the Gavagai problem, from the recognition that reference is inscrutable, that we cannot say what exists absolutely, but only what exists relative to a framework. The anthropologist sits with a notebook, the word Gavagai recorded, the translation uncertain, and the native speaks, and the anthropologist interprets, and communication proceeds approximately, pragmatically, successfully enough for practical purposes, and whether Gavagai really means rabbit or something else remains undetermined, remains a question without an answer. And Quine's problem persists, not as a practical obstacle to translation, but as a philosophical challenge to theories of meaning, as a demonstration that meaning is more elusive than we thought, more dependent on interpretation and less determined by facts. And the Gavagai problem endures as one of Quine's most influential contributions, a thought experiment that changed how philosophers think about language, about meaning, about translation, and about the relationship between words and world. And the problem remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent feature of linguistic philosophy, a reminder that understanding each other is harder than it seems, that meaning is indeterminate, that communication is an achievement rather than an automatic consequence of shared language, and that the gap between what we say and what we mean, between our words and their reference, can never be fully closed. And the rabbit runs past and the native says, Gavagai, and we translate approximately, hopefully, never quite certain that we have understood. Synesthesia. Paradox. Why numbers have colours and sounds have tastes. A person looks at the number 5 and sees it as blue, not imagines it as blue, not associates it with blue, but actually sees blue, experiences colour as an intrinsic property of the number. And another person hears music and tastes chocolate, hears certain chords, and the taste appears involuntarily, automatically. And these experiences are synesthesia, are cross-modal sensory experiences where stimulation in one modality produces perception in another. And synesthesia is not metaphor, is not learned association, is a genuine perceptual phenomenon experienced by roughly 4% of the population. And the paradox is that synesthetes experience properties that are not physically present, see colours that are not in the stimulus, taste flavours that have no source, and yet these experiences are consistent, are reliable. The same numbers always evoke the same colours, the same sounds always evoke the same tastes, and this reliability distinguishes synesthesia from imagination or association, shows that synesthesia is automatic, is perceptual rather than cognitive, and the phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how the brain is organised, shows that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, but can communicate, can influence each other, and synesthesia represents an extreme of this cross-modal interaction, represents a neural architecture where connections between sensory areas are stronger than normal, are sufficient to produce conscious experiences in one modality when another is stimulated. Imagine being a grapheme colour synesthete, the most common form where letters and numbers evoke colours, and you read this text and every letter has its own colour. A is red, B is green, C is yellow, and the colours are vivid, are as clear as real colours, are not vague or imagined but are perceptually present. And when you see the letter A, you cannot help but see red. The colour is automatic, is triggered by the visual form of the letter, and this colouring happens for all letters and numbers, creates a richly coloured experience of reading. And while this might sound beautiful, it can also be distracting, can interfere with reading when the printed colours conflict with synesthetic colours, can create confusion, and yet for synesthetes, this is normal, is how the world has always looked. And they're often surprised to learn that others do not experience letters as coloured, that the colours are unique to synesthetes. Synesthesia demonstrates that perception is not modular, is not strictly segregated by sensory modality, and in synesthetes there is cross-activation. There are connections between sensory areas that do not exist or are weaker in non-synesthetes, and these connections allow activity in one area to trigger activity in another. And when grapheme area, the region that processes letter and number shapes, is activated, it also activates colour area, the region that processes colour, and this cross-activation produces the experience of coloured letters. And neuroimaging studies have confirmed this, have shown that when synesthetes see numbers, colour areas of visual cortex are activated, are lit up, and this activation is automatic, is bottom-up, is not produced by conscious thought or imagination, but is triggered by the stimulus itself. Visualize the brain as having sensory areas that are normally separate: visual area, auditory area, taste area, and these areas process their respective inputs and pass information to higher level regions. But in synesthetes, there are additional connections. There are pathways between sensory areas that allow direct crosstalk, and these pathways are the neural basis of synesthesia, are what allows stimulation in one modality to produce experiences in another. And the connections are not learned, are not created through experience, but are developmental, are present from early life. And synesthesia is lifelong, is consistent. The same cross-modal experiences occurring throughout the synesthete's life. The synesthesia paradox is that these experiences are perceptual, are as real as any other perception, and yet the properties perceived are not present in the stimulus. The number 5 is not blue, is black on white, and yet the synesthete sees blue. And this challenges theories that say perception is veridical, is accurate, is a representation of physical reality. And synesthesia shows that perception can include properties that are not in the world, that are generated internally, and yet these properties feel external, feel like properties of objects rather than like internal mental states. And this raises questions about the nature of perception, about what it means for perception to be of something, about whether all perception involves some degree of construction, some degree of adding properties that are not in the stimulus. One theory of synesthesia is that everyone is born with extensive cross-modal connections, that infant brains have connections between all sensory areas, and during development, most of these connections are pruned or eliminated, and sensory areas become more segregated. And in synesthetes, some of these early connections are preserved, are not pruned, and this preservation allows the cross-modal experiences to continue into adulthood. And this theory is supported by evidence that infants show some synesthetic effects, show cross-modal correspondences, and that synesthesia runs in families, has a genetic component, suggesting that genes that regulate synaptic pruning are involved. Another theory is that synesthesia involves disinhibition, involves normally present connections between sensory areas that are usually inhibited, are suppressed, and in synesthetes this inhibition is weakened, is less effective, and so the connections are active, allow cross-activation, and this theory is supported by evidence that synesthesia can be induced temporarily in non-synesthetes through drugs that reduce inhibition, through hypnosis, through sensory deprivation, suggesting that the neural machinery for synesthesia is present in everyone, but is normally inhibited, and synesthetes have less inhibition, have more open channels between sensory areas. Synesthesia also has practical implications. Some synesthetes report that their experiences are useful, provide memory aids, make information more distinctive, easier to remember, and some musicians with sound-colour synesthesia report that the colours help with composition, with understanding musical structure, and some artists deliberately cultivate synesthetic experiences, use them as sources of creativity. And understanding synesthesia has implications for education, for recognizing that people process information differently, that sensory experiences vary across individuals, and that teaching should accommodate these differences, should recognize that some students have richly colored experiences of letters and numbers, while others do not. The phenomenon also raises questions about consciousness, about qualia, about the subjective properties of experience, because synesthetes have different qualia than non-synesthetes, have color experiences that others do not. And this shows that consciousness is not uniform, is not the same across individuals, and qualia vary. And this variation is not just quantitative, is not just more or less of the same experience, but is qualitative, involves entirely different types of experience. And this challenges theories that say all consciousness is universal, is the same for everyone, and supports theories that say consciousness is individual, is constructed by each brain in potentially different ways. And synesthesia is one example of this variation, is one way that consciousness can differ. Some philosophers argue that synesthesia shows that perception is not representational, does not represent external properties, because the colours seen by graphema colour synesthetes do not represent anything in the world. The number 5 is not blue, and yet the colour is perceived, and this challenges representational theories of perception, suggests that perceptual experiences are not always representations of external properties but can be internally generated responses. And synesthesia is a case where the response includes properties that are not being represented, and this raises questions about what makes perception representational, whether all aspects of perception are representations or whether some are merely responses are produced by the perceptual system without representing anything external. The number appears black on white, and the synesthete sees blue, vivid and automatic. The colour is as real as the number, is as perceptually present, and yet the colour is not there, is not in the stimulus, is generated by the brain, is a cross-modal activation, and the synesthesia paradox remains: perception includes non-veridical properties, includes experiences that do not correspond to stimulus properties, and yet these experiences are automatic, are reliable, are as perceptually real as any other, and synesthesia endures as one of the most fascinating phenomena in neuroscience, a demonstration that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, that cross-modal connections exist, that perception can include internally generated properties, and that consciousness varies across individuals, includes experiences that are unique, that are not shared by everyone, and the colours remain overlaid on letters, triggered by sounds, evoked by tastes, and the cross-modal world of synesthetes continues, different from the world non-synesthetes perceive, richer in some ways, more confusing in others, and the phenomenon persists. The arrow paradox. Motion seems so simple, so obvious. An arrow flies through the air from bow to target, and no one doubts that it moves. Yet the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea posed a question that has troubled thinkers for over 2,000 years, a question about whether motion is even possible at all. And this is the arrow paradox, one of Zeno's many arguments against the reality of change and multiplicity. Consider an arrow in flight, frozen at a single instant of time. At that precise moment, the arrow occupies a specific region of space exactly equal to its own length and width. It is not in two places at once. It is simply where it is motionless, static, indistinguishable from an arrow at rest. At the next instant, the same is true. The arrow occupies a space equal to itself, motionless at that frozen moment, and at the next instant, and the next. And if time is composed of a sequence of such instants, then at every instant the arrow is motionless. And if the arrow is motionless at every instant, then how can it be said to move at all? For motion would require the arrow to be in more than one place at a single instant, or to be in a state of transition rather than a state of rest, and yet at any given instant there is no motion, only position. Zeno used this paradox to support the Eleatic philosophy of Parmenides, which held that change and motion are illusions, that reality is a single, unchanging whole, and that the apparent diversity and movement we perceive are mere deceptions of the senses. The arrow paradox strikes at the very concept of instantaneous velocity, the idea that an object has a speed at a single moment in time, and Aristotle attempted to refute Zeno by arguing that time is not composed of indivisible instants, but is continuous, that motion is not a series of static positions, but a process that unfolds over intervals, and that the paradox arises only if we mistakenly treat time as a collection of frozen moments, rather than a flowing continuum. Modern physics offers a different resolution through calculus, where velocity is defined as the derivative of position with respect to time, a limit that describes how position changes as the time interval approaches zero. And in this framework, instantaneous velocity is a well-defined concept. The arrow does have a speed at each moment. even though speed is not a property that can be observed in a single instant, but only inferred from the relationship between position and time. Yet some philosophers argue that the arrow paradox still points to something genuine and unresolved, a mystery about how the static and the dynamic relate, how a series of stillnesses can add up to motion, how being in a place can somehow become moving between places. Quantum mechanics adds another layer to the puzzle, because at the subatomic level, particles do not have definite positions and velocities simultaneously. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that the more precisely we know a particle's position, the less precisely we can know its momentum. And in some sense, the arrow paradox prefigures this strange quantum behavior, the idea that motion and position are not entirely compatible descriptions of reality. The paradox also connects to debates about the nature of time itself, whether time is discrete or continuous, whether it flows or is an illusion, whether the present moment is all that exists or whether past and future are equally real, and whether change is fundamental or derivative. Zeno's arrow hangs suspended in thought, motionless at every instant, yet undeniably in flight, a puzzle that refuses to vanish despite millennia of analysis, a reminder that even the most basic experiences, the flight of an arrow, the passing of time, the reality of motion, rest on assumptions that can be questioned, that beneath the surface of the obvious lies a tangle of conceptual difficulties that no amount of mathematics or physics has entirely smoothed away, and the arrow flies still, or perhaps it never moved at all, frozen forever in the paradox that bears its name. The Bertrand's box paradox. 3 identical boxes sit before you, each containing 2 coins. The first box contains 2 gold coins, the second box contains 2 silver coins, and the third box contains 1 gold coin and 1 silver coin. And you cannot see inside the boxes, cannot distinguish them from the outside. And a box is chosen at random and opened, and 1 coin is drawn from it, also at random, and the coin turns out to be gold. And now a question is posed that seems simple, but leads to surprising confusion. What is the probability that the other coin in the same box is also gold? And the intuitive answer that most people give is 1/2, reasoning that since the drawn coin is gold, the box cannot be the one with 2 silver coins. So it must be either the box with 2 gold coins or the box with 1 gold and 1 silver. And these 2 possibilities seem equally likely, and so the probability that the other coin is gold should be 1/2. But this reasoning is wrong. The correct answer is 2/3, and this is Bertrand's box paradox, named after Joseph Bertrand, who presented it in 1889, a puzzle in conditional probability that reveals how easily intuition misleads when reasoning about random processes and conditional information. The error in the intuitive reasoning lies in treating the 2 remaining boxes as equally likely, but they are not, because the probability calculation must account for how the gold coin was observed, must condition not just on which box was chosen, but on which coin was drawn. And the key insight is that there are 3 gold coins in total, 2 in the first box and 1 in the third box, and the drawn coin is equally likely to be any of these 3. And if the drawn coin is one of the 2 from the first box, then the other coin in the same box is also gold, while if the drawn coin is the one from the third box, then the other coin is silver. And since 2 of the 3 equally likely possibilities lead to the other coin being gold, the probability is 2/3, not 1/2. Another way to see the solution is to consider all possible outcomes. There are 6 coins in total, labelled gold 1 and gold 2 in the first box, silver 1 and silver 2 in the second box, and gold 3 and silver 3 in the third box, and each coin is equally likely to be the one drawn, and we're told that a gold coin was drawn, which eliminates silver 1, silver 2 and silver 3, leaving gold 1, gold 2 and gold 3 as equally probable. And if gold 1 was drawn, then the other coin in the same box is gold 2. If gold 2 was drawn, then the other coin is gold 1. And if gold 3 was drawn, then the other coin is silver 3. And so in 2 of the 3 cases, the other coin is gold, giving a probability of 2/3. The Bertrand-Box paradox is structurally similar to other probability puzzles, like the Monty Hall problem and the Three Prisoners problem, where conditioning on partial information updates probabilities in non-obvious ways, where the process by which information is revealed matters as much as the content of the information, and where naive intuition fails to properly account for the structure of the problem, and the paradox illustrates the importance of specifying the sample space carefully, of identifying all possible outcomes and their probabilities, and of using Bayes' theorem or other formal tools to update probabilities rather than relying on informal reasoning. The paradox also raises questions about the reference class problem, about which population of events the observed outcome should be considered a member of, because the intuitive error involves thinking of the outcome as selecting a box type, either 2 gold or mixed, rather than selecting a particular coin. And this shift in reference class changes the probabilities, and the correct solution requires identifying the right reference class, the set of all coins that could have been drawn, and calculating probabilities relative to that set. Bertrand's box paradox has pedagogical value. It is often used in teaching probability to illustrate conditional probability, to show how careful reasoning differs from intuitive judgment, and to demonstrate the value of systematic methods like constructing probability trees or using Bayes' theorem. And students who understand the paradox gain insight into a common class of errors that arise from failing to properly condition on all relevant information, from treating distinct events as equiprobable when they are not, and from confusing the probability of a hypothesis given evidence with the probability of evidence given a hypothesis. The paradox also appears in variations, sometimes with coloured balls instead of coins, sometimes with different numbers of boxes or different distributions, and each. Variation tests slightly different aspects of probabilistic reasoning, but the core lesson remains the same, that conditional probabilities must be calculated carefully, that intuition is unreliable, and that formal methods are necessary to avoid systematic errors. And the paradox connects to real-world situations where similar reasoning is required. Medical diagnosis, where symptoms must be interpreted in light of disease prevalence and test reliability. Legal reasoning, where evidence must be weighed in light of prior probabilities and alternative explanations. And machine learning, where classifiers must be trained to properly account for base rates and conditional dependencies. The boxes sit on the table, indistinguishable from the outside. The gold coin gleams in your hand, and the question hangs in the air: what is the probability that the other coin is also gold? And the answer, 2/3, contradicts the intuitive 1/2. And the gap between intuition and mathematics reveals something about how we reason about chance, about how we estimate probabilities, about how we update beliefs in light of evidence. And the Bertrand-Box paradox remains a touchstone, a simple puzzle with a surprising answer, a demonstration that probability is subtle, that conditioning changes things in non-obvious ways, and that even questions that seem straightforward can hide complexity, can require careful analysis to answer correctly. And the paradox endures as a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a reminder that mathematical reasoning is necessary to avoid errors that intuition cannot prevent. And the gold coin sits there, evidence that shifts probabilities, information that updates beliefs, and the calculation proceeds, formal and precise, yielding 2/3, and the intuition retreats, humbled by mathematics, corrected by careful thought. And the lesson is learned again, that probability is counterintuitive, that conditional reasoning is hard, and that paradoxes like Bertrand's box serve an essential function, exposing the gaps between how we think we reason and how we actually should reason, between the quick judgments of intuition and the slow calculations of mathematics. And the boxes remain coins inside, waiting to teach the next student to confound the next intuition, to reveal once more that chance and evidence interact in ways that defy expectation. And the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a permanent fixture in the pedagogy of probability, a puzzle that generations of students have encountered and been surprised by, and will continue to encounter as long as probability is taught and intuition needs correction. The blind sight paradox. Why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience. And the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field. And vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them. And the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness, whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience. And experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, I don't know, I can't see anything there. And the experimenter says, just guess, point to where you think it is, and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. Says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists, trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components, conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious. And damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behavior, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight, they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness. Theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience, and this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity. And the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential, and this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blind sight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses, and these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing. And this response denies the complete dissociation, argues that some phenomenology remains in blind sight, even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness, and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes. And blind sight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blind sight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blind sight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing. feel nothing, experience nothing in that region, and yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior. And the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology, and the blind sight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research. A real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways, and the blind sight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The Bell spaceship paradox. When two rockets pull a string apart, two identical spaceships float in space, separated by some distance, let us say 1 kilometer measured in their initial rest frame, and a thin thread connects the two ships, stretched taut but not under tension, and now both ships fire their rockets simultaneously, both accelerating at exactly the same rate, both reaching the same velocity at the same time as measured in the original rest frame. And the question arises, what happens to the thread? Does it break or does it remain intact? And the paradox is that two different lines of reasoning seem to give opposite answers. One argument says the thread remains intact because both ships accelerate identically and maintain constant separation in the original rest frame, while another argument says the thread must break because of length contraction, and this is Bell's spaceship paradox, proposed by physicist John Stuart Bell to clarify misconceptions about special relativity and the nature of length contraction. Consider the first argument. In the original rest frame, both ships start 1 kilometer apart, and both ships accelerate at the same rate, their velocities remaining equal at all times, and so the distance between them, as measured in the original rest frame, remains 1 kilometer throughout the acceleration. The ships maintain constant separation, as measured by rulers at rest in the original frame, and the thread, stretched between the ships, also spans 1 kilometer in this frame. And if the separation does not change, then why would the thread break? It experiences no increased tension, no stretching, and so the thread should remain intact. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to follow directly from the symmetry of the situation. But now consider the second argument, from the perspective of someone accelerating with the ships, someone in the instantaneous rest frame of the spaceships at any given moment. And in this frame, the distance between the ships is undergoing length contraction relative to the original frame. The proper distance between the ships, the distance measured by a ruler moving with the ships, is greater than 1 kilometer and growing because the ships are maintaining constant coordinate separation in the original frame, while length contraction says that moving objects are contracted. And so to maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame, the proper separation must increase, must stretch, and the thread, a physical object with a rest length, cannot stretch indefinitely without breaking. And so the thread must snap as the proper distance between the ships increases beyond the thread's breaking point. Bell's answer, and the correct answer according to relativity, is that the thread breaks. The second argument is correct, and the error in the first argument is subtle. It confuses coordinate distance in the original rest frame with proper distance measured by moving rulers. And length contraction does not mean that objects physically shrink in their own rest frame. It means that the relationship between coordinate distance in one frame and proper distance in another frame involves a contraction factor. And when two ships maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame while accelerating, they are actually increasing their proper separation. the distance measured by rulers that move with them, and the thread, stretched between the ships, experiences this increasing proper separation as tension, and eventually the tension exceeds the thread's strength and it breaks. Imagine the situation more concretely. Place a series of markers at rest in the original frame, spaced 1 meter apart, stretching from the first ship to the second ship. And initially, there are 1,000 markers spanning the 1 kilometer between the ships. And now, the ships accelerate, and at any given instant in the original frame, the ships remain at the same markers they started at. The distance between them measured by these markers remains 1,000 meters, but from the perspective of the moving ships, the markers are getting closer together, are contracting, because the markers are in motion relative to the ships, and so the ships see more and more markers passing between them. The number of markers spanning the gap increases, and this means the proper distance between the ships is increasing, and the thread, which has a fixed rest length, cannot span this increasing proper distance, and it breaks. The paradox reveals a common misconception about special relativity, the idea that if two objects start with a certain separation and undergo identical accelerations, then they must maintain the same separation. But this is false. Maintaining the same coordinate separation in one frame requires increasing proper separation when the objects are accelerating. And this is because acceleration is not relative in the way velocity is. Accelerating objects experience forces, have proper accelerations that can be measured by accelerometers on board, and two spaceships with identical proper accelerations do not maintain constant proper separation. They drift apart in their own instantaneous rest frames. Bell used this paradox to clarify that length contraction is a real physical effect, not merely a coordinate artifact or an optical illusion. The thread really breaks. Real physical forces are involved, and the contraction of moving objects is a consequence of how electromagnetic forces between atoms transform under Lorentz boosts. And these forces are what hold matter together, what give objects their rigidity, and when objects accelerate, the forces adjust. And in the Bell spaceship scenario, the adjustment causes the thread to experience tension and eventually to snap. The paradox also connects to the Ehrenfest paradox, another puzzle in special relativity involving rotation and length contraction, where a disk spinning at relativistic speeds seems to have a contracted circumference but unchanged radius, leading to apparent contradictions with Euclidean geometry. And both paradoxes illustrate that accelerated motion introduces subtleties that are not present in inertial motion, that naive applications of length contraction can lead to errors, and that careful analysis using the full machinery of special relativity is required to get the right answers. Visualize the two spaceships accelerating in lockstep, their separation constant as measured by observers at rest, but the thread between them stretching from the ship's perspective, growing taut, fibers straining and eventually snapping, breaking in the middle, the two halves trailing behind each ship, and the observers at rest see the thread break. Even though the ships never change their coordinate separation, and this breaking is real, is frame independent, all observers agree that the thread broke. Though they may disagree about why, about what forces were involved, but the physical fact of the breaking is invariant, is an event in spacetime that everyone can observe. Bell's spaceship paradox remains a challenging problem in relativity pedagogy. Many students, and even some physicists, initially get it wrong, arguing that the thread should not break, and the paradox serves as a test of whether someone truly understands length contraction and the relativity of simultaneity, whether they can correctly apply these concepts to accelerating objects. And the paradox has generated extensive discussion in physics journals, with papers clarifying the resolution and exploring variations. And it stands as a reminder that special relativity, despite being over a century old, still contains subtleties that require careful thought, that intuitions about space and time must be constantly checked against the formalism, and that even seemingly simple scenarios can hide deep complexities. The rockets fire, the ships accelerate, maintaining constant spacing in the original frame, and the thread stretches, taut and straining, and then snaps, unable to bridge the growing proper distance. And Bell's paradox resolves, the thread breaks, relativity vindicated, and the lesson learned, that acceleration changes things, that maintaining coordinate separation requires increasing proper separation, that length contraction is real and physical, and that relativity continues to surprise, continues to challenge intuition, continues to reward careful analysis with deeper understanding of how space and time and motion interweave to create the strange but consistent fabric of relativistic physics. The bald man paradox. A man stands before a mirror, his hair full and thick, and no one would call him bald, this much is certain. And yet time passes and hairs fall, one by one, slowly at first and then with gathering speed. And the question that haunts philosophers is simple and unanswerable. At what precise moment does this man become bald, after which single hair crosses the threshold from not bald to bald, and the intuition rebels against the idea that one hair could make such a difference, that the removal of a single strand could transform a person's category, could change a truth about them in such a fundamental way. The bald man paradox is a version of the Sorites paradox, focused specifically on baldness, but illustrating the same underlying problem about vagueness, boundaries, and the limits of classification. And it asks us to consider whether baldness admits of sharp boundaries, or whether it is inherently vague, a matter of degree rather than kind. And if it is vague, then how can we use the term meaningfully? How can we say that someone is bald or not bald when there seems to be no clear line separating the two states? Imagine the process in reverse, starting with a completely bald man, hairless and smooth, and now a single hair appears on his head, and surely one hair does not make him not bald. The presence of a single hair is negligible, imperceptible to casual observation, and if one hair does not change baldness, then neither does two, and if two do not, then neither does three, and this reasoning continues, step by step, until the man has a full head of hair, and yet according to the logic he should still be bald because no single hair made the difference, and this conclusion is absurd, and so something must be wrong with the reasoning, but what? The paradox forces a choice between several uncomfortable positions. One option is to accept that there is a sharp boundary, a precise number of hairs that separates bald from not bald, perhaps 10,000 hairs or 5,000 or some other specific number, and anyone with fewer hairs than this threshold is bald, while anyone with more is not bald. And this view preserves classical logic, maintains that every statement is either true or false, that vagueness is merely epistemic, a matter of our ignorance about where the true boundary lies, but this position strikes many as implausible because it seems arbitrary. There is no principled reason why 10,000 hairs should be the cutoff rather than 10,001, and the idea that baldness depends on such a precise count feels wrong, disconnected from how we actually use the term. Another option is to reject the idea of sharp boundaries and embrace the view that baldness is genuinely vague, that there are borderline cases where it is neither determinately true nor determinately false that someone is bald, cases where the world itself does not settle the question, and this view requires abandoning or modifying classical logic, accepting that by valence, the principle that every proposition is either true or false does not hold for vague predicates, and this leads to various non-classical logical systems, three-valued logics where propositions can be true, false or indeterminate, fuzzy logics where truth comes in degrees ranging continuously from 0 to 1, supervaluationism where a statement is true if it is true on all acceptable ways of making the vague term precise, and each of these approaches has costs and benefits. Each preserves some intuitions while sacrificing others. A third option is contextualism. the view that whether someone is bald depends on the context of utterance, on the standards and purposes operative in a given conversation or situation. And in one context, a man with 5,000 hairs might count as bald, while in another context only someone with fewer than 1,000 hairs would count. And this view makes baldness relative rather than absolute. And it explains why borderline cases feel uncertain, because in borderline cases the context has not provided enough information to determine which standards apply, but contextualism faces challenges too. It must explain how context determines standards, whether there are constraints on what standards can be operative, and whether contextualism avoids the Sorites paradox or merely relocates it to the question of when contexts shift. The bald man paradox also connects to broader questions about language, reference, and the relationship between words and the world. Because if most predicates in natural language are vague, and they are, nearly every adjective and many nouns admit of borderline cases, then vagueness is not a peripheral issue, but a central feature of how we communicate. And any theory of meaning must account for it, must explain how. Vague terms can be useful and informative despite their lack of sharp boundaries, and must address whether vagueness is a feature of language, of thought, of the world, or of all three. Some philosophers argue that vagueness is purely linguistic, that the world itself is precise and determinate, but our words are blunt instruments that fail to carve reality at its joints, while others suggest that vagueness exists in thought as well, that our concepts are themselves fuzzy, and still others propose that the world itself contains vague objects and properties, that reality does not always come with sharp boundaries, that nature is continuous and gradual in ways that resist precise classification. The paradox has practical implications as well. In law, where terms like reasonable and substantial and significant must be applied to real cases despite their vagueness. In medicine, where diagnostic criteria often involve thresholds that are somewhat arbitrary. In ethics, where drawing lines between permissible and impermissible actions may require confronting borderline cases where intuition provides no clear guidance. And in each of these domains, the bald man paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a genuine obstacle to clear thinking and fair judgment. The paradox also raises questions about personal identity and change over time. Because if baldness is gradual, then so are many other properties, aging, growing, learning. And if there are no sharp transitions, then perhaps personal change is also vague. Perhaps there are cases where it is indeterminate whether someone is the same person they were years ago, whether they have changed in significant ways or remained essentially the same. And this connects to deeper issues about persistence, continuity, and what it means to endure through time. The bald man stands as a symbol of all borderline cases, all situations where reality resists the either-or structure of classical logic, where predicates fade gradually from clear application to clear non-application, passing through a twilight zone where truth becomes uncertain. And the paradox endures because it exposes a tension between the precision we expect from rational thought and the vagueness inherent in the world and in language, and no solution has won universal acceptance. Philosophers continue to debate whether to accept sharp boundaries, revise logic, relativize truth to context, or adopt some more radical approach. And the bald man remains poised between categories. Neither clearly bald nor clearly not bald in the borderline cases, a living embodiment of the limits of definition, a reminder that the world does not always cooperate with our desire for clarity, and that some questions may have no determinate answer, not because we lack knowledge, but because the questions themselves presuppose a precision that reality does not provide. And the hairs fall one by one, and baldness approaches, and no single hair marks the moment of transformation, and the paradox persists, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent feature of the conceptual landscape we must navigate, a crack in the foundations of logic that cannot be sealed. The Abilene Paradox: Why Groups Choose What Nobody Wants. A family sits on a porch in Coleman, Texas, on a hot afternoon, comfortable, playing dominoes, and the father-in-law suggests driving to Abilene for dinner, 53 miles away in a car without air conditioning. And the suggestion is not enthusiastic, is tentative, but the son-in-law says sure, sounds good. Not because he wants to go, but because he assumes others want to go, and he wants to be agreeable. And the wife says yes if you all want to go, and the mother-in-law says of course, and they all pile into the car and drive to Abilene in dusty heat, arrive hot and tired, eat mediocre food, drive back exhausted, and sitting on the porch again, someone admits they didn't really want to go, and then everyone admits they didn't want to go, admits they only agreed because they thought others wanted it, and the entire group took an action that no individual wanted, chose an outcome that everyone preferred to avoid. And this is the Abilene Paradox, described by management professor Jerry Harvey, a phenomenon where groups make decisions that contradict the preferences of all members, where collective action diverges from individual preferences, not through majority rule or compromise, but through misperception, through failure to communicate, through assumptions about what others want. And the paradox reveals that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be unwanted by everyone. And the Abilene Paradox shows a different kind of collective irrationality from Condorcet cycles or voting paradoxes. Shows irrationality that arises from social dynamics, from conformity pressure, from reluctance to dissent. And the paradox remains relevant for understanding group decision-making, for recognizing that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through false consensus, through everyone going along with what nobody wants. Imagine the psychology of each family member. Each sits on the porch comfortable, each prefers staying home, but each hears the suggestion and thinks, well, if someone is suggesting it, they must want it. I don't want to be the one who ruins everyone's plans. I should be agreeable. Go along, be a team player. And so each agrees despite preferring to stay, and no one voices their actual preference. No one says I'd rather stay home. And the group collectively creates a false impression, creates the appearance of consensus when none exists, and everyone interprets others' agreement as reflecting genuine preference rather than social accommodation. And this mutual misperception drives the group toward an outcome no one wants. And the paradox unfolds. The trip is taken, the unwanted dinner eaten, and only afterward does truth emerge. Does communication clarify that everyone preferred staying home? And the group confronts the absurdity, the recognition that they did something no one wanted through failure to communicate authentically. The Abilene Paradox differs from groupthink, where group members genuinely conform their preferences to the group, genuinely come to believe the group view. And Abilene involves no genuine preference change, involves only misperception, only assumption about what others want, and members maintain their private preferences, but suppress them out of social pressure, out of desire to be agreeable. And this suppression is the source of the paradox, creates the gap between public agreement and private preference, and the gap allows groups to pursue actions that everyone opposes. And breaking the paradox requires someone to voice dissent, to say, actually, I'd prefer not to go. And this dissent can reveal that others feel the same, can break the false consensus, but dissent is risky, is socially uncomfortable, requires challenging what appears to be group preference. And most people avoid this, prefer to go along, and the paradox persists. Visualize the Abilene Paradox as a coordination failure, where the optimal outcome requires everyone to reveal their true preferences, requires honest communication, but social norms and psychological tendencies prevent this, create pressure toward agreement, toward accommodation, toward not rocking the boat. And these pressures are strongest when relationships matter, when group harmony is valued, when dissent risks social costs and family dinners and work teams and community groups all face Abilene risks. All can make decisions that no one wants, through false consensus, through failure to communicate authentically. And the paradox shows that agreement is not always good, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, that groups need mechanisms for authentic communication, need cultures that encourage dissent, need permission to disagree. One lesson from the Abilene paradox is the importance of honest communication, of creating environments where people feel safe expressing disagreement, where dissent is welcomed rather than punished. And organizations that suffer repeated Abilene paradoxes often have cultures of false harmony, have norms that discourage challenging proposals, have leaders who interpret dissent as disloyalty, and these cultures create conditions for Abilene, create pressure toward agreement, and preventing the paradox requires changing culture, requires valuing truth over harmony, requires encouraging people to voice concerns. And this is difficult, requires conscious effort, requires leadership that models disagreement, that rewards dissent, that avoids shooting messengers. Another lesson is about decision-making procedures, about how groups can avoid Abilene through structured processes, through anonymous voting, through devil's advocate roles, through explicit checking for consensus, through asking not just who agrees, but who disagrees and why. And these procedures create space for dissent, create permission to voice opposition, and reduce pressure toward false consensus. And effective groups use these procedures systematically, build them into decision-making, recognize that surface agreement may hide opposition, and these procedures are especially important for high-stakes decisions, for commitments that are costly to reverse. And the trip to Abilene is costly, is unpleasant for everyone, and could have been avoided with better communication. The Abilene paradox also appears in organizational settings, in corporations where teams pursue strategies that no one really supports, in committees that adopt policies no member wants, in groups that invest in projects everyone privately doubts. And these organizational Abilenes are costly, waste resources, damage morale, produce outcomes that serve no one's interests. And preventing them requires organizational awareness, requires training people to recognize Abilene dynamics, requires creating cultures where speaking up is safe, where dissent is valued, and many organizations fail at this. Have cultures of deference, have hierarchies, where subordinates agree with superiors even when privately opposed. And these cultures are Abilene-prone, create repeated paradoxes, and organizational effectiveness requires breaking these patterns. Some argue that the Abilene paradox is overstated, that genuine cases are rare, that most group decisions reflect genuine preferences of at least some members, and while everyone agreeing despite everyone opposing is uncommon, partial Abilene is more common, where some members oppose but remain silent, and the group pursues a course that a vocal minority supports while a silent majority opposes. And this partial Abilene is still problematic, still produces suboptimal outcomes, and preventing it still requires encouraging dissent, requires creating safety for opposition. The paradox also raises questions about responsibility, about who is responsible when groups make decisions no one wants. And the answer is everyone and no one. Everyone contributed through silence, through false agreement, through failure to voice opposition, but no one individually caused the outcome. No one individually chose wrongly. Each made a reasonable social decision to accommodate perceived group preferences. And the collective outcome is worse than any individual action merited. And this shows how social dynamics can produce results that exceed individual culpability, can create group failures that no individual intended. And avoiding such failures requires collective awareness, requires group-level solutions, requires changing communication patterns and decision procedures. The family sits on the porch afterward, hot and tired and annoyed, and someone admits they didn't want to go, and the admissions cascade. And everyone realizes the absurdity, realizes they collectively did something no one wanted, and the Abilene paradox is revealed, and laughter mixes with frustration, and the lesson is learned. The importance of honest communication, the danger of false consensus, the need to voice dissent, And the paradox remains a permanent reminder that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through excessive agreeableness, through mistaken assumptions about others' preferences, through social pressures that suppress authentic communication, and the Abilene paradox endures as a cautionary tale about group decision-making, a demonstration that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, and that preventing collective irrationality requires creating environments where dissent is safe, where truth is valued over harmony, and where groups communicate authentically rather than accommodating falsely. The boy or girl paradox. A family has 2 children, and you're told that at least one of them is a boy, and the question is posed, what is the probability that both children are boys? And the intuitive answer is 1/2, because the other child is either a boy or a girl with equal probability, but this reasoning is incorrect. The actual probability is 1/3, and this is the boy or girl paradox, a puzzle in conditional probability that has generated confusion and debate for decades, with different versions yielding different answers depending on exactly how the information is obtained and what assumptions are made about the selection process. The solution proceeds by considering all possible, equally likely combinations of 2 children. There are 4 possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, girl-girl, and girl-girl, where the order matters because the first child and second child are distinct even if both are boys or both are girls. And if we are told that at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl possibility is eliminated, leaving 3 equally likely cases: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. And only in one of these 3 cases are both children boys, and so the probability is 1/3, not 1/2. The paradox arises because the conditioning statement, at least one is a boy, is not the same as knowing the gender of a specific child. If instead we are told that the older child is a boy, or the younger child is a boy, then the probability that both are boys becomes 1/2, because we are conditioning on a specific child being a boy rather than on the existential claim that at least one child somewhere in the family is a boy. And this distinction, subtle as it seems, makes a crucial difference to the probability calculation. The boy or girl paradox has many variations that probe the boundaries of the problem and reveal how sensitive the answer is to the exact specification of the scenario. One famous variant involves meeting a man who says he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Tuesday, meaning the boy was born on a Tuesday, and this additional information about the day of the week changes the probabilities in a surprising way, because it reduces the number of scenarios consistent with the statement, and the probability that both children are boys increases from 1/3 to 13/27. And this result seems bizarre, seems like the day of the week should be irrelevant, but the mathematics is sound. The additional specificity affects the conditional probabilities. Another variation asks, what if you meet a man with 2 children, and you see one of them, a boy? Does this change the answer? And the answer is yes. Seeing a specific boy is different from being told that at least one child is a boy, because seeing introduces selection effects. You are more likely to see a boy in families with 2 boys than in families with 1 boy, and so the probability calculation must account for the process by which the information was obtained, and different processes lead to different answers. And this sensitivity to selection effects is a general feature of conditional probability problems, and it explains why the boy or girl paradox has multiple defensible answers depending on the scenario. The paradox connects to the reference class problem and to debates about the principle of indifference, because applying the principle of indifference requires specifying a reference class, a set of equally likely outcomes, and different choices of reference class lead to different probability assignments. And in the boy or girl paradox, the reference class could be families with at least 1 boy, or it could be situations where someone tells you that at least one child is a boy. And these are different reference classes with different probabilities. and there is no neutral or obvious way to choose between them without more information about how the scenario is set up. The paradox also raises questions about the interpretation of probability statements in natural language, because phrases like "at least one is a boy" can be interpreted in different ways, as a statement about the existence of a boy in the family, as a statement about what someone knows or has observed, or as a statement about what information has been communicated, and each interpretation leads to different formal models and different probability calculations. And this ambiguity in natural language is a source of many probability paradoxes, where the mathematical answer depends on details that are not fully specified in the informal statement of the problem. Bayesian statisticians and frequentists also interpret the paradox differently. Bayesians treat probability as degrees of belief and calculate conditional probabilities using Bayes' theorem, while frequentists treat probability as long-run frequencies and may question whether the conditional probability is well defined without specifying a clear sampling procedure. And these different philosophical approaches to probability lead to different emphases in how the paradox is understood and resolved, though both traditions agree on the mathematical calculations once the problem is precisely formulated. The boy or girl paradox has practical analogues in genetics and medicine, where the probability of certain conditions depends on family history in ways that are similar to the structure of the paradox. For instance, the probability that a family carries a recessive genetic trait depends on how many children are observed to have the trait, and the calculations must account for ascertainment bias, the fact that families are more likely to come to medical attention if they have affected children, and this bias affects the probability assessments in ways that parallel the selection effects in the boy or girl paradox. The family walks down the street, 2 children beside them, and you know that at least one is a boy, and the question remains, what is the probability that both are boys? And the answer depends on how you came to know this fact, on whether you asked about a specific child or about any child, on whether you saw a boy or were merely told that at least one exists, and each variation of the scenario changes the answer, shifts the probabilities, reveals that conditional probability is sensitive to context, to process, to the mechanisms by which information is acquired and communicated, and the paradox persists as a puzzle, as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of how subtle probability can be, how carefully problems must be formulated, how easily intuition can mislead. And the boy walks ahead, evidence of his existence, shifting probabilities, conditioning beliefs, and the mathematics unfolds, precise and unforgiving, calculating 1/3 or 1/2 or 13/27, depending on the details, and the intuition struggles to keep up, struggles to grasp why the day of the week matters, why seeing is different from being told, why reference classes and selection effects have such profound impacts on what should be simple questions, and the paradox endures, unsettled in the sense that people continue to disagree about which answer is correct for which version, continue to debate whether the problem is well posed, continue to find new variations that test the boundaries of conditional probability, and the family continues walking. The boy or boys or boy and girl continue existing, and the question remains open, answerable only when the scenario is specified with enough precision to eliminate ambiguity, to fix the reference class, to determine the selection process, and until then, the paradox lives on. A reminder that probability is not just mathematics, but interpretation. Not just calculation, but careful attention to how information is obtained, how questions are asked, and how evidence is generated. The Allais paradox. Maurice Allais, a French economist and Nobel laureate, presented a pair of choices in 1953 that revealed a systematic pattern of preferences violating the independence axiom of expected utility theory, and this became known as the Allais paradox, one of the most influential demonstrations that human decision-making deviates from the prescriptions of standard rational choice theory. And the paradox shows that people's preferences can be influenced by irrelevant alternatives, by outcomes that occur in both options and should therefore cancel out, yet somehow affect which option is chosen. The first choice involves two lotteries. Lottery A offers a certain gain of $1 million, while Lottery B offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million, an 89% chance of winning $1 million, and a 1% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery A, the certain million, preferring the sure thing to the gamble, even though the gamble has a higher expected value. And this preference reflects risk aversion, a common and generally accepted feature of human decision-making. The second choice involves two different lotteries. Lottery C offers an 11% chance of winning $1 million and an 89% chance of winning nothing, while Lottery D offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million and a 90% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery D, the gamble with the higher potential payoff, accepting the slightly lower probability of winning in exchange for the much larger prize. The paradox emerges when these two preference patterns are analysed together, because the independence axiom of expected utility theory requires that if Lottery A is preferred to Lottery B, then Lottery C should be preferred to Lottery D. And the reason is that Lotteries A and B differ from Lotteries C and D only in that there is an 89% chance in both A and B of receiving $1 million, and in both C and D this 89% outcome is replaced with winning nothing, and this replacement should affect both lotteries equally, should not change the preference order, because the independence axiom says that preferences between lotteries should depend only on outcomes where the lotteries differ, not on outcomes that are the same in both. And the 89% probability mass is shifted in the same way for both pairs, and so if you prefer A to B, you should also prefer C to D. And if you prefer D to C, you should also prefer B to A. The typical pattern of preferences, A over B and D over C, cannot be represented by any utility function satisfying the expected utility axioms. And so the Allais paradox demonstrates that people systematically violate the independence axiom, that their preferences are sensitive to common outcomes in ways that expected utility theory does not permit. And this violation is robust, appearing in experiments with diverse populations, with real monetary stakes, with careful experimental design. And the paradox cannot be dismissed as error or confusion, but represents a genuine feature of human decision-making. The paradox has inspired alternative theories that can accommodate the observed preferences, including prospect theory, developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which modifies expected utility theory by introducing reference points, by treating gains and losses differently, by allowing for probability weighting where people overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. And these modifications can explain the Allais preferences, because in the first choice, the certainty of $1 million receives extra weight, making Lottery A more attractive, while in the second choice the small probabilities are overweighted, making the 10% chance of $5 million in Lottery D seem more appealing than the 11% chance of $1 million in Lottery C. Other theories include regret theory, where people anticipate the regret they would feel if they made the wrong choice. And this anticipated regret influences preferences in ways that violate independence, because the certain million in Lottery A avoids the regret of choosing the gamble and losing everything, while the choices between C and D do not have this asymmetry. And rank-dependent utility theory, which generalizes expected utility by allowing the utility of lotteries to depend not just on outcomes and probabilities, but on the rank ordering of outcomes, and this allows for preferences that violate independence while maintaining other desirable properties. The Allais paradox raises normative questions about rationality. Some argue that the independence axiom is a fundamental requirement of rational choice, that violating it leads to incoherence, to preferences that can be exploited through Dutch books or money pumps, to decision-making that is systematically suboptimal, and that people who exhibit allez preferences are making mistakes and should revise their preferences to conform to expected utility theory. While others argue that the independence axiom, while mathematically convenient, is not a necessary condition for rationality, that it does not capture important aspects of how people value uncertain prospects, that preferences like those in the allez paradox reflect legitimate concerns about certainty, regret, and the context of choice, and that we should revise our normative theories to accommodate these preferences rather than dismissing them as irrational. The paradox also has practical implications for economics and policy, because if people systematically violate independence, then markets may not function as standard theory predicts. Risk preferences may be context-dependent. Insurance and investment decisions may be influenced by framing effects, and policies designed to maximize expected utility may not align with what people actually prefer. And understanding these deviations from expected utility helps explain phenomena like the equity premium puzzle, the disposition effect, and other anomalies in financial markets and economic behavior. The lotteries sit before you, the choices must be made, and your preferences, revealed through your choices, tell a story about how you value certainty and risk, about how you weigh probabilities and outcomes, and the story violates the axioms of rational choice, violates the clean mathematical structure of expected utility theory, and yet the choices feel reasonable, feel justified, feel like they reflect something important about value and uncertainty that the theory misses, and the paradox persists. The gap between theory and behavior remains. The independence axiom is violated again and again in experiments and in life, and decision theorists must choose. Either insist that the axiom is normatively binding and that violators are irrational, or acknowledge that the axiom is too strong, that rational choice is more complex than expected utility allows, and that new theories are needed to capture the richness of human decision-making. And the allez paradox remains a landmark, a decisive demonstration that classical rational choice theory does not fully describe or prescribe human behavior, a challenge that spawned new theories and new research programs, and a reminder that rationality is contested, that what counts as a reasonable choice depends on assumptions and frameworks that are themselves open to question, and the lotteries remain, the choices remain, the preferences remain, and the paradox endures, unsolved in the sense that no consensus has emerged about whether the preferences are rational or irrational, about whether we should revise our theories or our preferences, about whether independence is a negotiable axiom or a non-negotiable requirement. And the debate continues. Philosophers and economists and psychologists arguing about what rationality requires, about what humans actually do, and about the relationship between these two questions. The barber paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows a single rule. He shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. And this rule seems simple enough until the question emerges. Does the barber shave himself? And suddenly the logic collapses into contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he should not shave himself because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves, which means, according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the loop tightens without escape, spinning endlessly between two impossible options. Bertrand Russell popularized this version of his own paradox as a way to make the abstract problem of self-referential sets more accessible, more human, more vivid, because a barber is easier to imagine than a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Yet the logical structure remains identical, a rule that turns inward and devours its own coherence. The paradox reveals something unsettling, about definitions and categories, that not all rules can be consistently applied, that language and logic can conspire to create situations that seem perfectly reasonable until examined closely, and then they shatter. Some philosophers argue that the barber simply cannot exist, that the rule itself is contradictory, and therefore no such barber could ever follow it in reality, while others suggest that the problem lies in assuming the rule must apply universally, that perhaps the barber is exempt from his own rule, or that the village contains no barber at all. The paradox also exposes the danger of self-reference, the way that statements or rules that loop back on themselves can generate infinite regress or outright contradiction. And this has implications far beyond barbershops, touching mathematics, computer science, law, and any system that attempts to regulate itself from within. In set theory, the barber paradox mirrors Russell's discovery that naive set theory permits the construction of sets that cannot exist without contradiction, forcing mathematicians to impose restrictions on which sets are allowed to form, creating hierarchies and boundaries to prevent self-reference from poisoning the system. The barber stands at the edge of reason, a figure trapped in a loop of his own making, unable to shave or not shave without violating the very rule that defines his existence, and in this way, he becomes a symbol of the limits of logic, a reminder that not every question has an answer, that some problems resist resolution no matter how carefully they are examined. The paradox lingers in the mind, a simple story about a man and a razor that somehow reveals a crack in the foundation of thought itself, and once noticed, it cannot be ignored, appearing again and again wherever rules turn inward, wherever systems attempt to contain themselves, wherever language reaches the boundary of what it can coherently express. The binding problem: how your brain unites what it processes separately. A neuroscientist examines how the brain processes visual information, discovers that different features of objects are processed in different brain regions. Color is processed in one area, motion in another, shape in a third, orientation in a fourth, and all these features are analyzed separately, by specialized modules, by distinct populations of neurons. And yet when you look at a red ball moving to the right, you do not experience color, motion, and shape as separate. Do not see redness here and roundness there and rightward motion elsewhere, but see a unified object, a red round ball moving right, and all the features are bound together, are experienced as properties of a single thing. And this creates the binding problem, the puzzle of how the brain, which processes features separately, creates unified conscious experiences, how separate neural processes give rise to integrated perception, how the many become one. And this problem is fundamental, touches on the nature of consciousness, on how neural activity becomes experience, on what unifies experience into coherent wholes, and no complete solution exists. Various theories have been proposed, but the binding problem remains one of the deep mysteries of neuroscience, a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of consciousness. Imagine the visual system as a factory, with different departments processing different aspects of the product. One department handles color, another handles shape, another handles location, and all work in parallel, all process simultaneously, and each department produces its output color information, shape information, location information, and somehow these separate outputs must be combined, must be integrated into a unified representation, must be bound together so that you experience a red ball rather than redness and roundness as separate unlocalized features. And the binding problem asks how this combination occurs, what mechanism ensures that the right features are bound together, that the redness is attributed to the round object and not to the square object that happens to be present in the scene. And this correct attribution, this accurate binding, is critical for coherent perception, for navigating the world successfully, and yet how the brain achieves it remains unclear. The binding problem has two aspects: the feature binding problem, which asks how different features of the same object are bound together, and the object binding problem, which asks how different objects are kept separate, are not confused with each other, and both aspects are challenging. Both reveal that perceptual unity is not given automatically by neural processing, but requires some mechanism, some process that groups features appropriately, and various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention has been suggested as a solution. The idea that attention binds features, that attended objects have their features integrated, while unattended objects do not. And this explains why feature binding errors occur when attention is diverted, why illusory conjunctions occur where features from different objects are misbound, are attributed incorrectly. Visualize attention as a spotlight that illuminates objects one at a time, and within the spotlight features are bound, are integrated, and outside the spotlight features remain separate, are not integrated, and this attentional binding theory has some support, has experimental evidence showing that feature binding requires attention, that without attention, features can be perceived separately without being bound correctly, and illusory conjunctions are more common under conditions of inattention, supporting the idea that attention is necessary for binding. But attention cannot be the complete solution, because some binding occurs pre-attentively. Some feature integration happens automatically before attention is applied, and so attention is part of the story, but not the whole story. Another proposed mechanism is temporal synchrony, the idea that neurons representing features of the same object fire in synchrony, fire together, and this synchrony is the binding code, is what marks features as belonging together and neurons representing different objects. Fire at different times or with different phases, and this temporal separation keeps objects distinct, prevents their features from being bound together. And this synchrony theory has been influential, has generated extensive research, has led to discovery of synchronized neural oscillations in visual cortex, but the theory faces challenges. It is not clear that synchrony is sufficient for binding, it is not clear that consciousness depends on synchrony, and some experiments have failed to find the predicted correlations between synchrony and perceptual binding, and the theory remains controversial. A third approach argues that binding occurs through convergence, through hierarchical processing, where features are combined in higher-level areas, and early visual areas process features separately, but project to higher areas that represent combinations, that have neurons responding to specific conjunctions of features. And these conjunction neurons represent bound objects, represent integrated wholes, and binding is achieved through this hierarchical architecture, through neurons that explicitly encode feature combinations. And this approach has support from single neuron recordings showing that higher visual areas have neurons with complex selectivity, neurons that respond to specific combinations of shape and color and motion, and these neurons could be the neural basis of bound object representations. The binding problem also connects to consciousness, because unified conscious experience seems to require binding, seems to require that separate neural processes be integrated into coherent wholes, and some theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory, make integration central, argue that consciousness arises from integrated information, from systems where different parts interact and constrain each other, and binding as a form of integration is the combination of separately processed features into unified representations. And understanding binding may be crucial for understanding consciousness, may reveal how neural processes give rise to unified experience. The problem also has practical implications. For understanding neurological conditions where binding fails, where patients see features but cannot bind them correctly, and such conditions exist. Barlint's syndrome is one example, where patients can see individual features but cannot perceive objects, cannot integrate features into wholes. And these patients provide evidence that binding is a genuine process, is not automatic, can be disrupted by brain damage, and studying these patients helps understand normal binding, helps identify the brain regions and processes necessary for feature integration. Some philosophers argue that the binding problem is really a problem about consciousness, about how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, about the hard problem, and binding is one aspect of this, is the problem of how separate neural processes give rise to unified conscious experiences. And solving the binding problem may require solving the hard problem, may require understanding how neural activity becomes experience. And this makes binding one of the deepest problems in neuroscience, a problem at the interface between neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The brain processes features separately, colour here, motion there, shape elsewhere, and yet you see unified objects, see red round balls moving, see integrated wholes, and how this integration occurs, how the separate processes give rise to unified experiences, remains one of the great unsolved problems. The binding problem stands, challenging, fundamental, revealing a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of perception. And various theories exist, various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention, synchrony, convergence, but no theory is complete. No theory explains all aspects of binding, and the problem persists as one of neuroscience's deepest mysteries. A puzzle about how unity emerges from multiplicity, how the brain binds what it processes separately, and the question remains open. The mechanism remains elusive, and the binding problem endures. The analysis paradox. Philosophy has long been concerned with analysis, with taking complex concepts and breaking them down into simpler components, with providing definitions that specify the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a term, and this project of conceptual analysis seems both important and straightforward. We want to know what knowledge is, what justice is, what truth is, and we proceed by analysing these concepts, by stating explicitly what they mean, by giving definitions that capture their essential features. Yet there is a paradox lurking here, a puzzle about whether analysis is even possible. And this is the paradox of analysis, first articulated clearly by C.H. Langford, and discussed extensively by G.E. Moore and others in the early 20th century. The paradox can be stated simply: suppose we offer an analysis of some concept. For example, we might analyse the concept brother as male sibling, and this analysis, if correct, should be informative, should tell us something we did not already know about what brotherhood consists in, should illuminate the concept by making its structure explicit. But if the analysis is correct, then the analysandum, the concept being analysed, and the analysans, the analysis itself, must have the same meaning. They must be synonymous, otherwise the analysis would be incorrect. It would not capture what brotherhood really is. And if they are synonymous, then the statement brother means male sibling should be trivial, should be like saying brother means brother, a mere tautology that provides no new information. And so the analysis cannot be both correct and informative. If it is correct, then it is trivial. And if it is informative, then it is not a genuine analysis, but merely a stipulation or a proposed change of meaning. The paradox threatens the entire project of conceptual analysis, because it suggests that analysis cannot do what it is supposed to do, cannot both correctly identify the meaning of a concept and provide new insight into that meaning, cannot be both true and interesting, and so either conceptual analysis is impossible, or our understanding of what analysis is and what it aims to achieve must be revised. One response to the paradox distinguishes between sense and reference, between the meaning of a term and what it picks out, and argues that an analysis can be informative even if the analysandum and analysans refer to the same thing, because they can differ in sense, in the way they present or describe that thing. And so the analysis brother means male sibling is informative, because even though brother and male sibling refer to the same set of individuals, they present that set in different ways, one as a family relation and the other as a combination of gender and kinship. And this difference in sense makes the identity statement informative rather than trivial. Another response appeals to a distinction between conceptual and factual knowledge, arguing that analysis does not provide factual knowledge about the world, but conceptual knowledge about our own concepts, that it makes explicit what was already implicit in our understanding, that it brings to consciousness the structure of concepts that we already possess and use, but have not fully articulated. And so, the informativeness of analysis is not the informativeness of discovering new facts, but the informativeness of self-clarification, of making our own conceptual commitments explicit and transparent. A third response associated with Quine and others skeptical of the analytic-synthetic distinction denies that there is a sharp line between conceptual analysis and empirical investigation, arguing that all beliefs form a holistic web where conceptual revisions and factual discoveries are intertwined, and that what we call analysis is really just careful reflection on our current best theory of the world, subject to revision in light of new evidence or theoretical considerations. And on this view, the paradox dissolves, because analysis is not supposed to be a priori or purely conceptual, but is continuous with empirical inquiry, and so it can be both correct and informative without any mystery. The paradox also raises questions about the methodology of philosophy, about whether philosophy can make progress through analysis or whether some other method is needed. And different philosophical traditions have taken different stances, with analytic philosophy traditionally emphasizing conceptual analysis as a central tool, while continental philosophy has been more skeptical of analysis, focusing instead on interpretation, critique, and phenomenological description. And the paradox of analysis has been one factor driving some philosophers away from traditional analysis toward other approaches. The paradox connects to issues about understanding and competence, because we seem to have a kind of implicit or tacit understanding of concepts like knowledge, justice, and truth. We can use these concepts correctly, can apply them to particular cases, can recognize when they are used inappropriately, and yet when asked to state explicitly what these concepts mean, to provide a definition, we struggle. And this suggests that conceptual competence does not require explicit knowledge of definitions, that understanding can be practical and procedural rather than theoretical and propositional, and that analysis attempts to convert implicit understanding into explicit knowledge, a conversion that is difficult and perhaps impossible to complete without remainder. The paradox also appears in the context of philosophical disagreement, because philosophers have been offering analyses of key concepts for millennia, and yet consensus remains elusive. Different philosophers provide different analyses of knowledge, of justice, of truth, and it is not always clear how to adjudicate between competing analyses, whether by appeal to intuitions about particular cases, by considerations of theoretical simplicity and fruitfulness, or by some other standard. And the lack of agreement raises the question of whether these concepts have determinate meanings that analysis can discover, or whether they are vague, contested, or essentially contested, such that no single analysis could capture all the ways they are legitimately used. The analysis paradox remains a puzzle at the heart of philosophy, a question about what philosophy is doing when it offers definitions and analyses, whether it is discovering pre-existing meanings, stipulating new ones, or engaging in some more complex activity that combines elements of discovery, stipulation, and rational reconstruction, and the paradox has not been definitively resolved. Different philosophers find different responses more or less compelling, and the debate continues, with implications for how we understand the nature and methods of philosophical inquiry. And the concept sits there, waiting to be analysed, inviting us to state its essence, to specify its conditions, to make explicit what we already implicitly know, and yet the analysis, when offered, seems either to tell us nothing new or to change the subject, to offer a different concept rather than clarifying the original one. And the paradox persists, a thorn in the side of analysis, a reminder that understanding is more elusive than it appears, that the gap between knowing how to use a concept and knowing what it means is wider than we thought, and that philosophy, despite its ancient commitment to clarity and definition, to making the implicit explicit and the confused clear, may be chasing a goal that is inherently problematic, inherently paradoxical, a goal that recedes as we approach it, that becomes more obscure the more we try to illuminate it, and yet we continue to analyze, to offer definitions, to seek clarity, because the alternative, giving up on understanding, seems worse. The Banach-Tarski paradox. A solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces, which can then be reassembled, using only rotations and translations, to form two solid spheres, each identical to the original. And this seems to violate conservation of volume, seems to create matter from nothing, seems to be impossible, and yet it is a theorem in mathematics, proven rigorously using the axiom of choice and the properties of infinite point sets. And this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, named after Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, who proved it in 1924. And the paradox reveals deep and counterintuitive features of infinite decompositions, of non-measurable sets, and of the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The proof proceeds by decomposing the sphere into a finite number of pieces, typically 5 or 6, and each piece is a set of points, not a solid region with smooth boundaries, but a scattered, disconnected, infinitely complex collection of points. And these pieces are non-measurable, meaning they do not have well-defined volumes in the usual sense. They cannot be assigned a size using standard measure theory. And this is crucial because measurable sets cannot be duplicated. Conservation of volume holds for measurable sets, but non-measurable sets escape this constraint. They can be rearranged in ways that seem to violate intuition, and the Banach-Tarski paradox exploits this by constructing pieces that are so pathological, so wildly scattered, that they can be rotated and translated to form two complete spheres. The decomposition uses the axiom of choice, the principle that given any collection of non-empty sets, there exists a way to choose one element from each set, and the axiom of choice is independent of the other axioms of set theory. It cannot be proven or disproven from the standard axioms, and some mathematicians reject it precisely because it leads to results, like the Banach-Tarski paradox, results that seem absurd, and rejecting the axiom of choice avoids the paradox. But it also cripples large parts of modern mathematics. Many important theorems depend on the axiom of choice, and most mathematicians accept it despite its counterintuitive consequences. The paradox applies only to objects in 3-dimensional space, or higher. It does not work in 2 dimensions. A disk cannot be decomposed and reassembled into 2 disks. And this is because the group of rotations in the plane is amenable, meaning it admits a certain kind of averaging that prevents paradoxical decompositions, while the group of rotations in 3-dimensional space is non-amenable, and this non-amenability is what makes the Banach-Tarski paradox possible. The fact that rotations in 3 dimensions can be combined in ways that allow pieces to be moved around and duplicated. The paradox raises questions about the relationship between mathematical objects and physical objects, because while the Banach-Tarski theorem is mathematically rigorous, it does not imply that a physical sphere can be duplicated. The decomposition involves infinitely complex sets, pieces that are not solid regions but scattered collections of points, with no smooth boundaries, and such pieces cannot be physically realized, cannot be cut or manipulated, and so the paradox is a feature of mathematical idealizations rather than a claim about physical reality. And this distinction is important. The paradox shows that mathematical spheres treated as sets of points behave in strange ways, but it does not threaten conservation of mass or energy in physics. Because physical objects are not sets of points but arrangements of atoms or fields or quantum states, and these are governed by physical laws that do not permit paradoxical duplication. Some mathematicians and philosophers argue that the Banach-Tarski paradox is not really a paradox but a theorem, a surprising result that reveals features of infinite point sets and non-measurable sets, and that calling it a paradox is misleading, suggesting contradiction when there is none, only counterintuitive behavior, and from this perspective, the paradox is valuable precisely because it challenges intuition, because it shows that infinite collections have properties that finite collections lack, that measure theory has limits, that the axiom of choice has strange consequences, and that mathematics is richer and stranger than naive expectations suggest. Others find the paradox troubling, a sign that something is wrong with the foundations, that the axiom of choice should be rejected or restricted, that non-measurable sets are pathological objects that should not be admitted into mathematics, and that theories which avoid such sets, like those based on constructive or intuitionistic logic, provide better foundations, and this debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, about what kinds of objects mathematics should study, and about the role of intuition in guiding mathematical practice. The Banach-Tarski paradox also appears in discussions of probability and decision theory, because if a sphere can be decomposed into non-measurable pieces, then probability distributions on spheres must be carefully defined to avoid assigning probabilities to non-measurable sets. And this technical requirement reflects the same underlying issue, that not all collections of points can be measured, that probability requires measurability, and that attempting to assign probabilities to arbitrary sets leads to contradictions or paradoxes. The sphere sits on the table, solid and indivisible to the eye, but mathematically it is a set of infinitely many points. And the Banach-Tarski theorem says that these points can be partitioned into pieces, 5 or 6 strange scattered collections, and these pieces can be moved, rotated, and translated, and reassembled into 2 spheres, identical to the original, and the volume has doubled, or seems to have doubled, but the pieces never had well-defined volumes. They were never measurable, and so nothing has been created, no conservation law has been violated, only the intuition that decomposition preserves size, and this intuition holds for finite decompositions, for measurable pieces, but fails for infinite non-measurable pieces, and the paradox endures, a theorem that sounds impossible, a result that challenges understanding, a demonstration that mathematics contains surprises, that infinity is stranger than imagination, that point sets behave in ways that solid objects do not, and that the axiom of choice, innocent as it seems, permits constructions that defy common sense, and the sphere duplicates, mathematically, if not physically. And the paradox remains a permanent fixture in the landscape of mathematics, a result that students encounter with disbelief, that mathematicians accept as rigorous yet counterintuitive, and that philosophers debate as revealing something deep about the nature of mathematical objects, about the limits of measure theory, about the relationship between infinite idealization and finite reality, and the sphere sits there unchanged and yet somehow doubled, a monument to the strangeness of infinity, to the power of the axiom of choice, and to the capacity of mathematics to prove truths that seem like impossibilities. The bootstrap paradox. There exists a strange loop in time where cause and effect chase each other in a circle, where information or objects appear from nowhere, with no origin, no creator, no beginning, and this is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible act of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, a paradox that emerges whenever time travel creates a causal loop that has no starting point. Imagine a time traveler who loves a particular symphony, and one day they decide to travel back in time to meet the composer, but when they arrive in the past, they discover that the composer has not yet written the symphony, and so the time traveler, eager to hear the music again, writes down the notes from memory and gives them to the composer, who then publishes it as their own work. And the symphony becomes famous, and years later, the time traveler hears it and falls in love with it and decides to travel back in time to meet the composer, and the loop is complete. The question that haunts this scenario is simple and unanswerable. Who actually composed the symphony? The composer received it from the time traveler, and the time traveler received it from the composer, and neither of them created it. The information simply exists within the loop, passed from future to past and back again, with no point of origin, no moment of creation, no author. The bootstrap paradox differs from the grandfather paradox because it does not involve contradiction. The timeline is perfectly self-consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no clash between cause and effect, and yet something feels deeply wrong, an intuition that things must come from somewhere. That information cannot simply exist without being created. The paradox appears in many variations: a book that writes itself, a watch that is given to a younger version of oneself, who then keeps it for decades before giving it back, a technology that is brought from the future and used to invent itself, and in each case the object or information becomes eternal, trapped in a loop of time, aging perhaps, but never truly beginning or ending. Some physicists accept the bootstrap paradox as a genuine possibility if time travel is real, arguing that closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, are permitted by general relativity under certain conditions, and that such loops might allow for causally self-sufficient systems where the past and future are mutually dependent. Others find the paradox deeply troubling, a sign that something is wrong with our understanding of causation, entropy, or time itself, because information in a loop would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, that order does not arise spontaneously from disorder, and yet in a bootstrap loop, the information appears to be perfectly preserved, never degrading, never increasing in entropy, existing in a kind of timeless stasis. The many worlds interpretation offers one way out, suggesting that the time traveler who delivers the symphony creates a new branch of reality, and that in their original timeline, the symphony had a different origin, but this solution feels like cheating, multiplying universes to avoid the discomfort of the loop. The bootstrap paradox forces confrontation with deep questions about the nature of causation, whether causes must always precede effects, whether the universe permits closed causal loops, and whether existence itself requires an ultimate origin, or whether some things can simply be eternal and self-caused, through time without beginning or end, defying the intuition that everything must come from something, that there must always be a first cause, a prime mover, a starting point from which all else flows.